Now, Vladimir Putin may not have offered any concessions, but he did seem to be dangling rewards in front of his US counterpart.
Russia and the United States have a lot to offer each other in trade, energy, digital, high-tech and space exploration. Cooperation in the Arctic and the resumption of inter-regional contacts, including between our Far East and the American West Coast, also seem relevant. In general, it's important and necessary for our countries to turn the page and return to cooperation.
Tyson is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, joining us from Kyiv right now. Tyson, welcome to the program. Now, we've seen Vladimir Putin trying to deflect the focus away from Ukraine there to future US-Russian cooperation. Do you think Donald Trump is convinced by that?
Well, there are a couple of signs that it didn't go as far as I think Vladimir Putin was hoping. You know, he brought a private sector delegation to Alaska. I think there was supposed to be a meeting, a broader meeting that would have included other stakeholders after the one-on-one meeting with, just a few advisors. That did not take place. But one of the Russians, Putin's true objectives at this was to start to cauterize the Ukraine issue in the dynamic between the United States and Russia and try to normalize everything else. And that's clearly going to be one of his key objectives in the coming months, is basically to say we have this one sticking point, which is Ukraine, but in everything else, it's time to bring in Russia from the cold.
Just wondering whether Putin would have been successful in sort of pushing Trump into accepting that Ukraine, the burden's now on Ukraine to give in.
He didn't go as far as some had feared. And I think just generally we heard from your correspondent here in Kyiv that there was some disgust with the optics of the meeting. But I will say that for the elites, I think that there is a sense of relief that President Trump did bring for him a modicum of discipline into this meeting in Alaska. There was no taking of questions from the press after the fact. He didn't, pontificate on land swaps or on any of the issues that seemed to be kind of constrained after his conversations with the Europeans and President Zelensky on Wednesday. So that's definitely a sign of a positive sign. But, it's really hard to say what comes next. I mean, we don't know what the issues that were agreed upon in the meeting. There's going to take some time to kind of unpack this. But just on Trump himself, he said basically, I've done my part. Now it's up to the Europeans and the Ukrainians. So I think we're getting back to a point where he's going to try to disengage from this negotiation.
We saw an attempt by Putin to flatter Donald Trump by suggesting that if President Biden, his predecessor, if Trump was in power rather than President Biden, his predecessor, that the war would not have gone ahead. How do you interpret that?
I think that kind of revisionist history lands extremely well with President Trump. The one point that he did seem to want to underscore was his interpretation of Russian meddling in the 2016 election, which of course has a domestic political element to it right now as we're speaking, because the intelligence community, Tulsi Gabbard, is trying to push a narrative that this was politically motivated by President Obama, and he pushed that. And when President Zelensky said, if you would have been president, which he believes, or he evinces to believe, that he had the election was stolen from him in 2020, that this war would not have taken place, that really flattered his ego. That fits into a revisionist history that he likes to talk about. And he repeated that line in his interview with Sean Hannity on Fox News after the fact. So I think that's going to be something that starts to stick with him, that he starts to emphasize that if it were under his watch, this war would have never started.
We also heard from Putin in English. He said next time in Moscow, referring to the possibility of a return visit by the US president. Trump himself didn't seem very non-committal in response to that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the President Trump that we know, the consistent behavior would be to kind of express some interest in such an overture, and in this case, he tended to demur, which shows that there are dynamics at play in the background. The fact that he got zero concessions from the Russians on Ukraine, the fact that this does seem to have been kind of a failure in terms of delivering substantial points, that he's not necessarily willing to engage in the next step at this point before kind of reviewing the options the United States and the allies have. And of course, this is something that he's going to have to take up in his conversations with the Europeans and the Ukrainians in the future. But I think, frankly, for him, he sees this as something that he has now invested a lot of attention capital in over the past week, and it led to very little for him personally. And so I think he's ready to kind of turn the page on this particular issue for a while.
And earlier you touched a bit on the domestic aspect of this. How would observers locally and analysts and just the general base be looking at this in the US?
Well, the MAGA base is pretty divided, although it can have some pro-Putin leanings, definitely buys into the idea that Russian meddling was a hoax. There is some sympathy with President Putin in some corners. There's also a heavy isolationist streak in the MAGA base. But what we see in the general public in the United States is that the support for delivering security assistance to Ukraine has increased, including from 30% in January among Republicans to now over 50% among Republicans. So the desire to provide military support to Ukraine has increased. And this move in and of itself is, Putin is extremely unpopular in the United States. He is seen as the authoritarian dictator that he is, in fact. And that it bears out in the polls across Republicans, Democrats, and independents. He has an 88% disapproval rating in the U.S. So, this is not a popular figure in the United States, and inviting him for a win to Alaska and getting nothing out of it is not going to deliver the political hay that I think that the president was hoping for.
Tyson Barker, we appreciate your thoughts. Thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you.
And for more on this, we now turn to DW's Russia analyst, Konstantin Eggert. Konstantin, who came away looking better from this meeting?
Well, frankly, I would agree with Ines Paul. Generally, Putin came away looking better, just for one reason even. Trump did not get the ceasefire he was promising to get during this talk. So it is already a victory for Putin. Image-wise, it is also interesting that Trump deferred to Putin, let him open the press conference, although this is traditional diplomatic protocol dictates that the receiving side speaks first. A few other bits and pieces. I think that Putin came away looking better. And of course, Gerhard, an important thing for him is to blast the domestic audience in Russia via the media, via the essentially state-controlled media, to present this meeting as an enormous success, as breaking out of isolation, as the fact that perseverance and patience of the Kremlin and of Putin personally, of course, paid off. So in this respect, he also got something domestically that is extremely important for him.
Now, if we look at the staging of this, I'd like to take a bit of a closer look at that, because first, Putin had to come to the US, not to a neutral country, as he would have preferred, but a US military installation. Secondly, he did get a red carpet, yes, but the red carpet was flanked by a display of America's most sophisticated fighter jets. And he didn't get a reception with military honors. Instead, he was greeted by a flyover by a B-2, that's a long-range stealth bomber, which can be equipped with nuclear weapons, yet another display of America's military power and long reach. Now, hasn't the US been sending some pretty strong signals here? What's your take?
Gerhard, I would agree that the US side made everything for it to look as essentially a kind of symbolic pressure on Putin. Whether it works on Putin, that's a different matter. But I think that maybe it would have worked better, in my view, personally, if Donald Trump was not promising too much before this meeting. Then it would have looked different. Now it looks as if Putin got all the time he wanted, and I also think he wrong-footed the US president when, in the very last moments of the press conference, he said, maybe next time in Moscow. And Trump, I don't think he was prepared for that. Even if they discussed it, my personal impression is that Trump was not prepared to air this particular scenario to the press, and Putin did it for him. So I'd say, yes, preparations for it to look, the military base flyover, the fact that it is, as you rightly said, the US territory, so Putin comes at the mercy, if you wish, of Trump, but Putin tried to squeeze maximum out of it, and I think to some extent he succeeded.
Now, at the press conference, Putin said he was genuinely interested in ending the crisis. Do you think he's really willing to give up his war goals?
Oh, come on, Darren, come on. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You know the answer to the question. Of course he isn't. And I would basically point you and our viewers to one particular phrase, which is was a key phrase in Putin's war lexicon. Addressing the root causes of the conflict will help solve the conflict. By root causes, Putin means essentially making Ukraine a Belarus on the Black Sea, a semi-colony of Russia, which will be completely incapacitated in its foreign and security policy, completely subjugated to Russia, and essentially sliced up by the Russian army. So Putin still stands on this position, this root causes thing. As long as you hear this expression from his mouth, coming from his mouth, just read it very straightforwardly. No deal at all. He's not moving 1 inch.
DW's Russia analyst Konstantin Eggert there. Thank you very much, Konstantin.